Welcome to the ITLS COVID-19 webinar titled The Immediate and Long-Term Implications of COVID-19 on Transport, Logistics and Lifestyle. We're delighted to have you all join us this morning, and we have a great lineup of speakers who will talk for 5 minutes, and then at the end of their short commentaries, we will open up to Q&A. I should also like to mention to you that the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen is where you need to type your questions, and we will attempt to assign them to the relevant speaker, unless you wish to refer to that speaker, once we have completed the presentations. We will be recording this session, and we will advise you when it is accessible. There will be no voice or camera for attendees, but you will be able to see the panelists, who I will introduce shortly at the time in which we will ask them to speak for 5 minutes. By way of introduction to the topic, I'd like to make a few introductory remarks. We all know that this is a very hot issue at the moment as we come out of restrictions, and the big challenges that this sector will face relate to the future role that public transport might play post-COVID, the challenges we face with social distancing in ensuring that we are able to function smoothly and efficient with shared modes, and this also includes rideshare, but also the likely implications this may have, either in the short or long term, on the use of the private car and hence congestion. Although it has been suggested that those who initially move to their car might suffer from high parking charges in some jurisdictions and hence will limit their use of the car, there's no doubt about it that there is some element of fear, perception or real in using shared modes, and our panelists will talk about these aspects shortly. It should also be mentioned that one of the greatest policy levers we may have moving forward is working from home, as many employees and indeed some employers have seen that this is an effective strategy. And as children go back to school, there is a view that this might mean that working from home will become as productive, or if not more so, than working in an office. With staggered working hours proposed and limits on the number of people in office space, we have a very interesting prospective short-term and long-term opportunity here to do what I've often called is to tame the peaks. So our speakers this morning will make comments on what our transport system might look like in the immediate future and possibly in the long term, and what this might mean for how government should respond. Well, enough from me. Let me now introduce our first speaker, and it's a great privilege to welcome Adrian Dwyer, who's the CEO of Infrastructure Partners Australia, which is the nation's leading public and private infrastructure think tank. Adrian has an extensive career in business, policy and public service across the private sector and the New South Wales and Australian governments, with expertise in transport, utilities, social infrastructure markets, and wider public administration. Over to you, Adrian.
Hi, David. Thanks everybody for having me. So I thought what I would do is cover the two time horizons that David spoke about, the more immediate reactions and then the longer term, what I would think of as opportunities. And I'll probably cover some different things to the other speakers and probably at a more macro level. So I thought I'd just reflect a little bit on what I've seen, my observations from the immediate response. So actually, the first observation I have is that for once our federation actually worked reasonably well. We found that the National Cabinet formed quite quickly. The decisions, for the most part, apart from maybe some missteps around schools and when they might be opened or closed, there was actually a reasonably good joined up response from government on the way we would move into the lockdown phase after we realised this pandemic wasn't going away on its own. So I think that my first reaction is that the National Cabinet worked actually reasonably well for its purpose. but clearly in the infrastructure sector, there were some big impacts that perhaps wouldn't have been foreseen just a few months ago. I remember talking to the CEO of an airport maybe 2 months ago, who was talking about a 5% hit from China being closed down. That same airport's now had a 97% reduction in revenue. So there were a lot of things that very quickly moved to the more extreme end, particularly for GDP-linked assets, things like toll roads, airports, and alike. One of the decisions that we saw driven particularly by the Commonwealth, but at a level that doesn't deliver infrastructure as much, was construction remaining open. I think that's been absolutely critical for the economy, but also for the infrastructure sector as well, particularly when we think forward to an infrastructure-led stimulus. Spooling up that type of activity is very difficult to do. So keeping the construction sector open was a crucial move. And also maintaining the pipeline of activity towards the reopening of the economy. So jobs that could be done from home, and I'm sure colleagues will talk to this, but things like engineering, consulting, parts of the bureaucracy, planning, all of that kind of construction planning work appears to have continued for the most part. Tendering and procurement appears to have continued for the most part, which sort of sets us up well on the other side of this. So there's been I think a legitimate and necessary distraction to some extent within the procuring agencies, where people have been pulled onto other tasks to do with the immediate COVID response. So we are starting to see some delays emerging in procurement, but nevertheless, the response has been good. And the talk about an infrastructure-led stimulus has been particularly interesting and moved to very quickly. Thankfully, that has tended to focus on the smaller scale projects and maintenance type works. We've heard lots of colleagues at places like Transport for New South Wales and elsewhere talk about actually there might be opportunities arising from lower patronage, and therefore it's an easier opportunity to do some of the maintenance and short-term work, but also thinking about that sort of $300 to $500 million project scale, things that are at scale but are also relatively easy to move into the market quickly. But the horizon I wanted to focus on the most is the longer term reform piece. So I think there's two parts to this. There's reforms that will come from necessity and reforms that we will want to pursue opportunistically. Most of the opportunistic ones are long-term reform opportunities that we've all been speaking about for years, but now there's actually an opportunity and a reason to do them, in part because COVID-19 has become a common enemy. And a common enemy means you can tend to break through things like political differences. You can tend to break through different layers of government operating in different ways. Because you have a common enemy, you can maybe address some of those longer term challenges. It surprised me how quickly some of our political leaders moved to that reform question. Dominic Perrottet, Tim Pallas, both very quickly, a couple of weeks in to the lockdown, were talking about how to, for want of a better phrase, not waste a crisis and actually tackle some of the reforms that they've been talking about for a long time. So some of those necessity-driven things, David mentioned work from home. I think there is potential, and there's no clear answer to this, but there are some scenarios, but work from home has potential to dramatically change the way we interact with transport systems, particularly, as David mentioned, when the kids go back to school. Right now, work from home is suboptimal for me, but that's because I'm looking after a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, as well as doing webinars and video calls and other things. But when they're back at school, it has the potential to be, at least as part of my working week, very powerful. But of course, if you have people working from home, say I work from home a couple of days a week, well, that has some pretty profound implications for calculations around patronage risk, around land use, around the way that I interact with the transport system. And not just from if I work from home in perpetuity or for part of the week, but perhaps it'll change the time I go to work. Perhaps I'll start earlier in the morning and come home earlier in the evening and pick up the kids, because I found actually it can work reasonably well working from home. So I think that depending on how that scenario plays out, it will have substantial impacts. I'm sure my colleagues will talk more about that in detail. It may be permanent, it may be not. Again, we might be talking about something that has an impact for a few years, but dissipates over time. It might delay the peaks, but not entirely put them off. I think resilience through design is going to be a major issue. And we heard early in the lockdown, we had one of these webinars, we had the global head of safety from MTR in Hong Kong, who spoke to us about some of the things they'd done in response to SARS in Hong Kong. Simple things like finding out that bathrooms on public transport were a major transmission point. So contactless bathrooms became a feature of their design. So stations in Hong Kong are now, automatic doors, a maze to get in rather than a door to open, because they were transmission points. And lots of other areas as well, where I think it's going to need to be a focus from a public transport perspective about how we use resilience in design. And typically we've thought of resilience around things like climate change and the like, but now we're going to need to think about pandemic resilience as well. Moving to the opportunistic side rather than necessity side, although there is one that's sort of in the middle, which is governments have clearly heavily injected capital into the economy. They will be capital starved in the future. I think that means we'll see things like asset recycling and efficiencies, requirements for efficiencies emerging as a much stronger theme into the future. So that might mean things like franchising of public transport, where government's trying to attack the operational side of the budget. So we should probably be aware of that as an emerging theme. And then I'm going to move to my wish list of things. Road user charging has now got to be on the agenda, both from a funding perspective and a demand perspective, although I think the funding perspective has to emerge first. State governments are cash strapped, and opportunities to raise capital through user charges will now emerge as a dominant theme. Lots of people on this call, fellow panelists included, have been talking about road user charging for a significant period of time. Road user charging for electric vehicles, for instance, has now got to be on the agenda for state governments because it's the thin end of the wedge on charging reform. Land tax has been mentioned a few times. If we think that things like working from home will change the way people interact with transport systems and their land use decisions, then land tax has to be a feature of future package. And again, these things can work together in unison. And finally, from an efficiency perspective, it's clear to me that, as I said earlier, the National Cabinet has worked and the decision-making architects have worked, albeit in the spectre of a crisis. But it does strike me that there may be at least a short-term opportunity to use something like the National Cabinet type architecture to accelerate the efficiency of decision-making around infrastructure, particularly if there's an infrastructure-led stimulus. I'm strongly advising governments, of course, to be aware when they're throwing millions and billions of dollars at the economy to stimulate it, that they don't make decisions that cost us in the long run. But National Cabinet might be an appropriate way to do that. Now, I'm conscious of time, David, and I don't know whether I've chewed up my full 5 minutes, but I'm sure there's others that have got important things to say as well. David, I can't hear you. It looks like you're muted.
Sorry. Yes, thank you, Adrian. We're well on time. So we'll move on now and introduce our second speaker, which is Cecilia Warren, who's the Director of Research and Development at IAG. And Cecilia leads the R&D function with responsibilities for collaborating with university and research partners, indeed works very closely with ITLS on a mobility as a service trial to deliver insights into the nexus between emerging technology and human needs in mobility, shelter and work. Over to you, Cecilia.
Thank you, David, and thanks, Adrian, for that great scene setting. I'm really fascinated from this whole scenario by just how observable it is that mobility is incredibly integral to every single day of our life and every single person. So we know that there's a concept called your travel budget. We can perhaps speculate that a lot of that has been taken up. The choice that we would otherwise have in that sort of roughly 60 minutes a day has been taken up by the need to travel to work. We've seen that the complete disruption that we've had arising out of COVID has really put such an extraordinary disruption to that we have not really seen that for a long, long time. Perhaps one thing that's slightly similar is what happened in London following the tube strikes in 2014, where you saw people realizing out of that they'd actually been making suboptimal choices around their travel. Now, we've got the opportunity to kind of rethink our travel when we head back out of lockdown and when we kind of cross the bridge, as it were. It seems to be the phrase of the moment. And how we think about that both as individuals, so the choices we make about our travel time, whether or not we return to work for those who can work from home, whether we sort of choose to continue to work from home, or whether in fact we don't have a choice. And then what workplaces do and what regulators do in terms of the broader settings that can influence all of these choices. So the interesting thing for me is really looking at what is it that we can do that can change and shape or reshape transport for the future, and not just something that we put up with. So we've put up with congestion, we've put up with road toll, we've put up with emissions that are really contributing to shorter lifespans in cities. I think it's up to 3,000 people per year who are affected by air pollution. So how do we rethink this? I think some of the things are, to the point that Adrian made in the choices around whether he chooses to work from home a few days a week or whether he goes back full time. I don't think that schools, is not going to be a lot of opportunity for schools to necessarily have children doing that from home, but certainly the choices that can be made at a broader level. I think thinking about, if we look at some of the early insights that we saw arising out of the trial that David mentioned, we had a mobility as a service trial in partnership with ITLS, with SCEDGO, and that was through the iMove CRC. And that really helped us to see the in-field part was underway during the COVID lockdown. And what we saw, of course, was an immediate drop in public transport usage and a drop in rideshare and an uptick in private car use. And I think this is some of the challenge that we now know we have to face, because if that is a pattern that continues going forward, then we really do run the risk that some of the benefits we've gained from mass transport will really be lost. And so how can we change that? Well, the influencing factors can be human decision making, so both at the individual and the broader level. Technology, so what sorts of technology do we now start to build into our systems around connectivity to ensure that we've got the data that we need, that people can make decisions based on real-time data, and even that we may need to sort of bring innovation into the public transport setting around the types of materials that are used on buses and public transport sectors. So I think the challenge that I'd really like us to shape the conversation around is just, what are the big things that we really want in our transport system, and then how do we make the decisions to get to those outcomes? Thanks, David.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. We move on to our third presenter, and we are keeping well to time, which is excellent. I'd like to introduce and welcome Michelle Batis, who's the Executive Director of the International Association of Public Transport, UITP, as we all know, in Australia and New Zealand. And UITP advocates for best practice public transport and sustainable mobility solutions. And Michelle has held senior positions in public transport, Victoria and Vic Roads, and is passionate about promoting urban mobility for the benefit of customers and broader communities. Welcome, Michelle, over to you.
Thanks, David. Great to be here and to contribute to, I think, a very important conversation about what's happening in relation to COVID-19 and its implications on transport and logistics. So I just wanted to take a few minutes to really go over what I'm seeing from around the world, and particularly how that relates to this region and particularly to Australia regarding public transport. And so I think what's really interesting, just for a bit of background, that around the world what we've seen is patronage levels on public transport systems drop 80 to 90%, and certainly the major cities in Australia have seen patronage levels at 90% down, but are starting to come back. And I think that what that presents here is a multitude of challenges, but also opportunities. So as we know, the government is announcing its opening back up strategy So as the economy starts to open back up, the challenge for public transport authorities and operators is how to maintain some sort of social distancing during this time. So because the demand had been so low, all of the authorities actually have maintained 100% service levels during this time and will continue to, except for WA, who did drop service levels down to a weekend timetable for a few weeks. But everyone's committed to 100%, which has allowed social distancing. Now, as the economy comes back, that social distancing will be compromised. There's no doubt about it. David, very early on in this webinar, you mentioned the lever that government has about people working from home. I'd put money on it, that's the path we're going down. So Scott Morrison released his 3-step plan on Friday. For every step, it said avoid public transport in the peak. Now you've got to think, you know, I'm in Melbourne. Melbourne has 850, 900,000 people a day in its CBD pre-COVID-19. 380,000 of those people are workers. Now for me, working from home, Adrian, doesn't suit me that well either. However, I've got to say, I'm actually not in a position to drive to work. So for me, actually, as that commuter, the choice really is I'm going to go in public transport in the peak, or I'm going to work from home or stagger. And I think that's what's facing authorities at the moment in terms of the choices they have. So what I see in Australia to be the focus for transport authorities will be how they manage demand. And they will do that in a way where where we are encouraging commuters to make a choice. I don't see the enforcement path as the key driver right now, although we might get to that. But so you look at Transport for New South Wales, who are about to release an app where customers will be able to see the capacity on different vehicles. Auckland has just done that, so passengers are able to make a choice. What we've seen from overseas in Asian cities is that if you're going to manage the passenger flow, it has to happen outside the station. And so I think that what we'll see here is a focus on how we can manage demand by spreading the peak, boosting service capacity in the off-peak times, and you know, really asking people to think about their mode choice and when they travel. Now, I'm sure Tony's going to talk about, you know, the focus on active transport that we're seeing with now cities in Australia announcing pop-up bike lanes, and hopefully that becomes temporary, and the funding available in New Zealand. I think what will be very interesting as well is to see whether there is mode shift in other ways. So in Shenzhen, for example, what's been very interesting to see as the economies open back up there in China, the perception of passengers on the network is that buses are safer. So we've seen an increase actually in bus patronage that's come back much faster than for rail. Now that's very interesting. Why would that be? Well, on the buses, actually, the windows are down, so there's fresh air coming in. Whereas when you go in the metro system, actually you're underground for hundreds and hundreds of meters. And so the perception there is around, well, actually catching the bus could be safer. And I think that's the challenge for public transport and authorities and operators around the world. It's not just how do you maintain some sort of social distancing, and certainly in Australia that has to be the key, because the mitigation measure otherwise that's seen in Europe and in Asia is wearing masks, which we know here is not the current part of the conversation. So
okay, jump off.
Sorry, I'm just hearing a bit of background noise there. So I think what we'll see is a focus here on encouraging people to think about their modes. Certainly we don't want people enticed back to their cars. We know that we'll see some of that. I mean, there've been huge traffic jams in Shanghai, in Paris, and you look at Shanghai, I mean, they're 65 to 70% of their normal patronage levels. But that's only people going to work. The nighttime economy hasn't opened back up. Certainly people aren't going on the usual kind of off-peak trips during the day, shopping, seeing their grandma. People are just using public transport to get to work. So in the Asian cities where the government hasn't encouraged working from home, you're seeing on a weekly basis an increase in patronage of 10 to 15% per week. Now we would expect here that there will be some encouragement of people working from home so that we don't actually get back to the pre-COVID-19 patronage levels. Indeed, Transport for New South Wales has said that it is not aiming to get back to pre-COVID-19 patronage levels. That is not the aim, actually. And so that's very interesting as well. So when we think about the longer term implications, number one, funding and financing of public transport. So in this country, the public subsidy is already very high. We only receive 20, maybe nearly 25% of fare box recovery, in terms of the revenue that's received from tickets that actually covers the cost of operating the transport networks. So the funding and financing part will be very interesting. Adrian flagged earlier about the franchise arrangements. Certainly we have franchise arrangements in Australia and Victoria where the operators carry direct revenue risk associated to the patronage on the network. The UK's implemented emergency measures around contracting arrangements to ensure the financial viability of operators during this time. And I think that that's a space to watch. There's no doubt going to be some considerations of changes in that space going forward. I think the other long-term implication is around potentially increased congestion in the future. So hopefully we can all be working together to ensure that that is managed. I'll leave it there, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. We move on to our next speaker, which is Tony Arnold, who's doing a PhD at ITLS on investigating how automated vehicles change walking and cycling travel behaviour using comparative case studies of Australia and Netherlands. And Tony's had a lifelong interest in cycling and is going to be talking about what post-COVID might mean in terms of walking and cycling. Over to you, Tony.
Well, thanks very much, David. I'm just going to share my screen there for everybody. So it's a pleasure to be here. Well, as Winston Churchill said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And while COVID-19 has taken a massive toll on many lives and economies, today I will discuss how transport is adapting to the pandemic and how walking and cycling may offer a mechanism to create better cities in a new post-lockdown world. So recent research by Beck and Henscher from ITLS have found that people are travelling less at the moment, with private car travel seeing the greatest reduction in trips, as you can see by these largely empty roads. While overall demand for travel has decreased remarkably, we have seen people flock to bicycle shops to get their old faithful back on the road. We have seen the hospitality economy shift from eat-in to home delivery by bicycle. And we have seen parks, beaches and footpaths full of people when permitted. Of course, this has made it difficult to practice social distancing. In response to this, Australian health experts have therefore called for our public spaces to be redesigned to accommodate walking, cycling and the social distancing that's required. These messages have been echoed around the world, with the current crisis seen by many as a catalyst for change in our transport systems. Governments around the world have responded, creating a range of measures, such as pop-up bicycle lanes, as shown in Leicester, Paris and New Zealand, widened footpaths, as shown in London, speed limit reductions, such as those in Brussels, where the entire city has been reduced to 20 kilometres per hour and all traffic signals have been turned off. And also the installation of barriers to prevent through traffic from using local streets, such as in Seattle. And in Australia, several government agencies have committed to building more cycleways, widening footpaths, and to generally make streets safer and more enjoyable for walking and cycling. The Department of Planning, Industry and Environment in New South Wales have announced a $15 million Streets as Shared Spaces program that can support essential workers to travel to work, support people working from home, contribute to the economic recovery of our local centres, activate high streets and improve the quality of our public spaces, support physical distancing, can support our community's well-being and ability to exercise, and can attract people back into public spaces as a safe way in a safe way when appropriate to do so. So what does the future hold? Well, if our streets do not change, then the future is likely to look much like the past. The main exception to this is that public transport may be less appealing and may even be able to carry fewer people as well as distancing measures are applied. However, it seems that streets are about to change. These changes are not just measures put in place for the COVID lockdown, but signal a permanent shift in priorities. For example, London is spending £2 billion to boost walking and cycling, Paris is creating 650 kilometres of cycleways, and Seattle's permanently closing 20 miles of residential streets to through traffic. Several other indicators suggest that there will be growth in walking and cycling in a post-lockdown world. As found by Beck and Henscher, people will be concerned about public transport, so they will be looking for other modes, such as walking and cycling. People will work from home more often, so they'll be making more local trips to grab a coffee, to grab a sandwich just around your local streets. People who have been walking and cycling during COVID will have made somewhat of a mental transition that makes them more likely to continue in the future. Cycling and micromobility devices such as scooters and electric bicycles are likely to grow in popularity, particularly in the food delivery economy. Before I finish, I just wanted to highlight what's at stake if we fail to adapt our transport and planning systems for a post-lockdown world. Brent Todarian sums it up well, pointing out that 1.35 million deaths occur in traffic crashes worldwide each year, and that our current transport systems also contribute to pollution and climate change, which are serious threats. But by creating great streets that support walking and cycling, we will not only be preparing for a post-COVID world, we will be addressing some of society's most intractable problems, such as climate change, traffic congestion, social inequality, and the negative health effects of our largely sedentary lifestyles. I'm looking forward to being part of that journey, and I'm sure we all are. So back to you, David.
Thank you, Tony. If you could unshare your screen. And now we finish with Professor John Nelson, who is the Foundation Chair in Public Transport, funded by Transport for New South Wales at ITLS. And John has particular interest in the application and evaluation of new technologies to improve transport systems, as well as policy frameworks and regulatory regimes necessary to achieve sustainable mobility. He's worked extensively in the public transport space, both in Europe and in Australia. And welcome, John, as our final speaker to hopefully round off the commentary before we open to Q&A.
Thank you very much, David. So just to preface a few remarks, both under short-term and long-term implications, starting with short-term, I think I really want to echo one of the comments that Michelle has already made about public transport. There's one certainty we have in an era of few certainties, and that is that public transport usage is not going to quickly rebound. There's a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear. Just look at some of the media reports today about anxious parents with children beginning to return to school. And a very significant finding from the ITLS survey, David, which you coordinated, relates to the question around concern over public transport hygiene. The first wave of respondents indicating that almost 60% of them were extremely concerned in this respect, comparing with only 5% pre-COVID. Social distancing on public transport, Michelle has already talked about that. Obviously, advice will vary and range between jurisdictions, but this will become a real burden as people return to work and to school. We haven't heard reference yet to the transportation networking companies. Think Uber, for example. And this is really going to be a lean time for them. You're not, as a passenger, you're not socially distanced from the driver, and you are possibly more confident in using an Uber than using public transport. But indications are that there's a mass movement away from TNCs, with consequently significant reductions, perhaps 20% staffing cut that Uber have been hinting at. I think we need to be moving towards looking at staggered starting places, staggered start times in the workplace, whether we're talking about education or retail or shopping. And as other colleagues have mentioned, we can learn from what's happening overseas from those who have confronted this earlier. So a phased return to the workplace sector, as we're seeing, for example, in Spain and Italy, whilst maintaining a working from home regime. Another phrase I wanted to bring into the conversation is travel demand management. And this surely is the time for TDM measures, TDM toolkits to come to the fore. Good public information, good messaging to support travel planning, is now more essential than perhaps it's ever been in living memory, at least. And employers have a strong role to play in this. You could argue perhaps it's even a duty of care issue. Longer term, we will have, as other colleagues have mentioned, a structural readjustment to the nature of work. I think this is relatively inevitable, particularly to contain and maintain growing traffic congestion. And this may need to be mandated by government if it isn't possible to do this voluntarily. So we may be looking at 1-2 days working at home for those who can do it, but spread over the entire working week. And to pick up on Tony's point, this is an opportunity to think about road space reallocation in the light of the current experience. I was reading a European piece recently referring to this as the new space race. Take the example of Milan, currently working on the emergency deployment of cycling infrastructure, pavement widening, rapid expansion of traffic calm zones, pedestrianizations of plazas, shared street zones, and so on. Is that something that we can really commit to work together on? We need to be able to provide space for physically distanced city living. And what we mean by a livable city, I think, will come very much to the fore. And certainly, from my perspective, a livable city is a city that has an extensive core public transport system, which of course takes us into what the future financing regimes for public transport are going to look at, which other colleagues...
We can't hear you very well, John.
Okay, right. I'm just going to perhaps wrap up at that point. In any case, my last point was that livable cities really need to have core public transport at the heart, and that takes us into future debates about future financing for public transport as well.
Thank you, John. Well, thank you all for your contributions. And now we move to Q&A. We have 12 questions that have just been presented together with a few from the beginning. I do apologize if we don't get to attend to all of your questions, but we will answer them all post the webinar, and we will assign questions to the appropriate panelist. I might start off though with a question to Adrian, and this was from Kushel Pans from Oricon. Given the reduced demand on public transport, how will this impact current and future government funding of mass transit?
Well, I think so. There's a few parts to that question. I think the first one is just a broader availability of funding question. So before you get to the point of project selection, it is clear that governments have heavily committed to investment in keeping the economy going through stimulus, through things like JobKeeper and extensions to social welfare programs. And there will be a reduced revenue, particularly well at all levels of government. So federal level, income tax, corporation tax are to some extent GDP linked, but at the state level, no one's buying and selling houses, so stamp duty has gone. Michelle mentioned cost recovery on public transport. Well, the public sector in most states exclusively owns the public transport fare box, shares it in some jurisdictions, but that's heavily down, so cost recovery will be even lower in those places. And the list goes on and on. GST will be down. So there's just a funding issue. That's something governments do have some levers to solve, but there will be less money available for some years to come from a government revenue perspective. Then there's the question of the viability of projects with things like reduced patronage, and that applies to public transport, roads. I think the only thing we're seeing at the moment with higher patronage is the NBN, and it's holding up remarkably well. All of that said, when I've been talking to treasurers and transport ministers around the country, and I've pitched a similar question, the response has been, we're not building this infrastructure for the next 5 years, it's for 100 years. It's particularly in reference to things like rail. And I asked the very same question to Treasurer Tim Pallis in Victoria. about a week ago, and he said, look, that's just, there might be blips, but we're thinking very long term about the infrastructure we're investing. So that's for the here and now. I think that challenge begins to emerge a lot more over decisions that will be made in 2, 3, 4 years' time, where depending on what we see in terms of a long-term decline in patronage. I think it's a very legitimate question. I don't entirely know the answer, but I think it will be impacted far more by lower government revenue to pay for projects than it is by changes to a perception of the value of a project because of lower patronage.
Thank you, Adrian. We now have 20 questions have come in, 5 in the last minute, so there's a lot of good questions. Let's try and get through them fairly quickly if we could, with a succinct answer. So I'm going to put the next one to Michelle. It's from Ashley McHarry, who says, school children make up a high proportion of the peak and they don't necessarily have a choice around travel times. How can we deal with this best?
Yeah, look, this is a good question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. So for a start, I don't think we can actually genuinely expect school children to maintain social distancing. I think the schools know this, the teachers know this. I think it is a case of doing our best. Now, the options there for authorities and operators, you know, can there be additional services? What does service adaptation look like? That has an impact on what operating model you have, but certainly that needs to be looked at. That's not easy in every jurisdiction based on the contracts they have, but that's got to be a focus. I think the other thing is that the government lever about staggering work times or working from home, it actually needs to target primarily the people who actually have that kind of flexibility and the employers that will agree to that. I think working parents who have to get their kids to and from school at certain times, I think that's more of a challenge for them around the working from home and staggering that peak, depending on the circumstances. So for school kids, that right now is the #1 focus for jurisdictions, because people are, the kids are returning to school now, whereas the workforce, there hasn't been an announcement yet on when that workforce is returning, the ones who are working from home, which your report said one in 3 working from home at the moment. So look, I think we'll see how that goes, but there's no easy answer for the school kids. In fact, human behavior, you know, I went to the shops yesterday and there were people in my face, right? So I think there's something around you know, we'll see how the behavior pans out with the people maintaining social distancing.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. There are a number of questions which I might have a stab at, but I'm open to anybody else to contribute, to do with how we will do our travel demand modelling in the future. Our modelling systems have not really coped adequately with extreme events. So the question is, to what extent will we need to modify the way we do our modelling and maybe revise our entire model systems? Gillian Akers is one of the people asking the question, as are a number of anonymous attendees. We believe this is a really, really important question, and all those organisations that have developed strategic travel demand models, for example, they're going to have to rethink where those models may still continue to have merit and where they might need modification. I think it's too early to say what the changes would be, but it does appear to be that there's a need for a good dose of, if you like, stated preference studies to understand future scenarios and to see what impact that has on things like the value of travel time savings and what other attributes are going to become far more important than travel times and costs, especially those linked to biosecurity. So excellent questions. A number of us, including ITLS, are starting to think about that. And I have recently done some simulation work to see what might happen under conditions when we actually have 25 to 50% to 75% loss in public transport patronage. So we will report that work in due course, but I think we need to distinguish between immediate impacts and long-term impacts, and I think therein is a challenge. Hopefully we can share this experience with others that have been developing and applying models. So the next question I'd like to put to Tony, and it does relate to a comment about cycleways. And this question has come in from Chin Ho. If I could just find it, because I'm just being inundated with questions here, has come in from Chin Ho about to what extent government is in a position and will in fact commit to introducing a huge amount of capacity for cycleways, which may involve removing space on footpaths and or on lanes of roads. To what extent do you think that is achievable, and will it happen?
Well, there's certainly a lot of opportunities out there. Currently, a lot of our local streets are treated very much as rat runs, so that people can go from one side of the suburb to the other side of the suburb very easily. I think people have valued that so that they can quickly get out of their neighbourhood in the direction they want to travel in. But it would be very easy to repurpose some of that space to make it safer for walking and cycling by actually reducing a lot of those rat runs that go through local streets. Certainly bike lanes are something that need to be rolled out over a long period. Proper separated bicycle infrastructure that will provide protection for people, because we know that the primary barrier to people taking up cycling more is their perception of safety. So if they don't feel safe to ride, then they won't be riding. So providing that separation is really key as well. I know that Chin had actually mentioned something about footpaths. I know that 6 of the 8 jurisdictions in Australia actually allow cycling for all ages on footpaths. But in New South Wales, you're allowed to ride with a child on a footpath, but you're not allowed to ride if you're an adult on a footpath. So that may be something to look into as well as a way of opening up more space for cycling in the future. Of course, you also have to consider how we sort of look after pedestrians as well, because it's going to impact on pedestrians. The main thing there is really where there's high activity levels, it's really important to get that separation in there, because in city centres, train station entrances and the like, where there's a lot of pedestrians, we really want to make sure that there's separation between pedestrians and bikes.
Okay, thank you, Tony. I think we better move on. We try and keep the answers fairly short. We now have nearly 40 questions. We're not going to get through them all, but I might ask one to Cecilia now, and it's a broad one that's motivated by Nicole Badstuber, and it really relates to a car-centric mobility future. And in a sense, this is a challenge for mobility as a service, or MAS, as to what extent we can try and turn around the risk that the car could become a dominant mode forever, rather than the opportunities that MAS offers.
I think it's such a great question, David. Thank you. And I think if we use the existing MAS trial that we have to give us some insight, and then also look to what sort of technology might help us overcome some of those challenges. So it's very real that people will choose potentially fear-based choices around potentially car over public transport. But we know there are surfaces that you can use that can kill the virus. We know that there's data and information that we can use. And I think really being quite proactive in how we support those who can work from home to work from home, just to simply take off capacity, that's going to be really important.
Thank you. There's a question to Adrian. In fact, there are a number of questions about congestion taxes, terrible use of words, I must admit, road user charges, and to what extent is this going to change government's view on how they might price the network? You did mention that it's a basis of funding initially, but it could have efficiency implications. So there's at least half a dozen questions. If you could sort of give an overview response, that would be great.
Yeah, a very brief response. So yeah, a clear distinction between road user charging and pricing. They're sort of two sides of the same coin. My view is that we should tackle the funding piece first, and tackle the charging piece later, notwithstanding the needs for to use price ultimately to manage demand. I saw a few questions coming through around state or federal. The reality is that the way our constitution works, it can only realistically be implemented at the state level. So there are two ways you could do that, either with the state's acquiescence allowing the Commonwealth to do it, which means you need all states to move at once, or one or more states together. I actually think the danger of cross-border issues and different systems in states is a bit of a furphy. There's perfectly legitimate reasons why you might want to implement it differently within different states. In terms of the reason to do it, it's a funding issue now. States will be starved of money, so there is a reason to do this where there hasn't been in the past, and it will be considered an opportunity. I also saw another question coming up about electric vehicles and the broader benefits that they have. Yeah, absolutely. In the future, electric vehicles could have broader benefits, particularly from an environmental perspective when they're powered by renewables rather than coal. But having a distance-based charge on all vehicles, which is the ultimate aim, doesn't have to be an impediment to electric vehicle uptake. There's another way. There are many other ways of doing that. It's not mutually exclusive to have a distance-based charge and a more equitable approach to uptake and subsidies through other means. But it is a thin end of the wedge that we can start with. I think in 20 years' time, we won't call them electric vehicles, we'll call them cars. And if they don't have a distance-based charge on them soon, then we'll miss the opportunity, and roads will forever be a free utility. And we know if something's free, it gets overused.
Thank you. A question to John. Try to share them around from Aitan Mileccio regarding all shared transport services that might try to address the biosafety concern of passengers post-COVID. How can policy making cope with the new design of vehicles, stations, and marketing, and generally TDM measures?
Okay, thank you. I think this issue of redesign, and we can start with public transport, is something that would be good to involve the community in, so that we get aspects of co-design there. I think there's a bit of a judgment call though in terms of how long we think the long term is. I mean, another phrase doing the rounds at the moment is we're in the era of UV until vaccine. So whilst we could talk about potential for reconfiguring railway carriages in the long term, or what the bus of the future might be, I think there's a little bit of a judgment call as to we should make that step. But I would like to see, a point I made, getting good information to citizens to enable them to make informed travel choices is probably the top priority at the moment.
Okay, thank you. Well, a question for me and McDonald from Vicar. I might ask Michelle to, I guess it's the issue about the responsibilities of government and the obligations of the actual bus operators themselves, and whether there may be a disconnect, as Ian says. He's concerned that there is contradictory advice, that at one stage they're told to reduce capacity on the buses, but they're also told to never leave a school child at the bus stop. Michelle.
Thanks, David. I think this is a conundrum always, because the policy around never leaving a child behind at the bus stop, which I think is actually a really important policy. As I said earlier, I do think that it will be a challenge to maintain social distancing with school children, particularly on buses. From a capacity point of view, the only way to really manage that is by adding additional services or encouraging those children to get to school by other means, and whether that might be through, having neighbours, sharing trips to drop kids off to school. There is definitely complexities to how authorities need to look at maintaining cleaning and sanitisation measures ongoing. So there's one thing about social distancing. The other thing is having confidence that the system is safe to use. And as John said, that's about communication. And it's never been more important to be communicating with your passengers on the channels that they're on and that they use, right? And I think that this is still an area for improvement. In China, they're using WeChat and TikTok and geo-targeting and really looking at different ways of communicating. And I think that we need to start looking at those as well, because we need to be communicating to passengers, how are we maintaining these systems in a safe way for you? And then I think in terms of the arrangements, I can see some contradiction in terms of you need to maintain social distancing, but you also need to pick up all the passengers and you need to do the cleaning. And I think that these things will be worked through, right? Like if you think about it, our life's changed so quickly within 8 weeks. And so that will continue to evolve. The processes will get better. Just to go back to a point that John was talking about, how long is this going to go? Well, what we saw worldwide from when the SARS pandemic hit, certainly in the Asian countries that were most impacted, took about 4 or 5 months to get patronage levels back up and get that confidence in the system. This has been a much larger impact. I think it's going to take much longer. But certainly, I think that this is something that will need to be taking into.
You've frozen. Okay, Michelle seems to have frozen, and just to make a comment that there's a suggestion that it's going to be a lot easier to expand bus capacity than expand rail capacity. And so this may be an opportunity for the bus sector to work with government to offer that additional capacity, even though it'll be operating on roads where there's a risk of interacting with high growth in car use. We just don't know, but it's a very interesting proposition about where is it easy to expand capacity immediately, and it's fairly clear that the bus is the solution. However, let me just move on to another question if I could, and this is really one for Adrian, but others can certainly chip in, and it's to do with the issue about the design of our cities in the long term. Is there anything that we've been observing thus far and may happen that could get us to rethink how we design our cities in terms of density and land use?
Well, I think there's a legitimate question about whether or not the relatively lower density of Australian cities has been beneficial in terms of the reduction in the spread of COVID-19. And I'm not a virologist, but I have seen other comments on that the lower density has been beneficial, and that might mean that it's an argument for those that believe in less dense cities and a more distributed society. I think that there are lots of micro design features. I think Cecilia mentioned things like materials in public transport that can kill viruses that might be preferenced in the future. I mentioned some things like design at stations that lower infection points. And then I think there is just, if one thinks about choices of housing in a future where you might be able to reasonably argue to your boss that 2 or 3 days a week from home makes sense, you might be more willing to bear a longer commute, which might have impact on things like the satellite cities, the likes of Wollongong, Newcastle, Geelong, wherever it may be. So I think that there's a whole bunch of open questions, but there was one question that came up in the feed here, which said, to what extent are we assuming an overreaction to this? Is this just in response to this pandemic or future pandemics? So I think that's an absolutely crucial question. I do think we will, for a long time, consider pandemic resilience, but people do tend to return to their historical behaviour. So there's a question as to what extent is this a sticky change versus a temporary one?
And that also leads to another question, Anonymous, about to what extent are we likely to use the immediate lessons to determine what priorities we make in future infrastructure. If we're going to return to the old post-COVID situation, maybe we should be careful about making decisions to reduce public transport capacity or roads for that matter. It's a very general question. Would you like to have a start, maybe Cecilia, and then we'll ask Adrian and move to Michelle and then to Tony?
Thanks, David. I think the big challenge that we have is where the funding comes from. So how we think about public infrastructure versus private usage and any commercial gain, whether we think about these things as utilities or not, and certainly how we think about embedding future connectivity so that we do have the right sort of infrastructure for the future is going to be really crucial.
Thanks. Michelle?
Thanks, David. I think what's really interesting is that we've already seen the Victorian and New South Wales governments come out and say that they are going to focus on a construction infrastructure agenda, given the job growth and the needs going forward to maintain the economy. I think it's important to reflect that I would say the majority of infrastructure projects that are going on in Australia are catch-up infrastructure, right? They're things that we needed 5 or 10 years ago. And certainly probably by the time that they do end up being built, will probably be at capacity. Now, yes, of course, that there's questions around population growth, migration, travel patterns, and the changes we'll see there. And certainly we saw the Secretary of Transport for New South Wales make some comments the other week about the fact that some of the planning assumptions and considerations for their development work will need to be looked at, particularly southeast versus the west. But I think at the end of the day, people will still need to move. right? And yes, there might be changes in working from home, but as your research found, that's 1 in 3 affected. There are still a lot of people who are using our networks, both road and public transport, and in the active modes. And so I think that, you know, what we will see is we will have to look at the way business cases are developed and what that BCR is, and that's been a challenge for quite some time now, right? We know that there's other factors that need to be looked at, and I think what we'll need to do is study now some of the travel patterns and behaviours to see what kind of impacts there are. But certainly, I think we're going to see a revival of the suburban centres. You know, I've not been to my local shopping strip so many times as I have in the last 2 months, and now it's part of my daily habits.
Yes, okay, thanks, Michelle. I'm just going to ask for a quick 1 or 2 sentence response from Adrian, and then Tony, and then John, and we'll conclude it. Adrian.
Yeah, I think it's a good point from Michelle. I've been to the local shops a lot. I think the themes that we were talking about pre-COVID, things like digitisation, convergence of different infrastructure sectors, resilience, are all as true today as they were before. There'll be changes at the margins to patronage, but they will return to trend eventually. So let's not deviate from the course on building the infrastructure we need.
Thanks, Tony.
Yes, I think diversification is really key here. So our cost benefit often just looks at a single project and comes up with a number for that. But diversifying by having options for walking and cycling, giving people choices about how they get around, I think are going to be really, really key, especially in conversations around getting kids to school as well. If kids can actually walk or cycle to school, that's going to be very important as well. So really diversifying our investment so that we have those options for walking and cycling as well as the public transport and cars.
John, final comment, quickly.
Well, we're aware now, if we weren't already, just how important good digital infrastructure is. We know there's a strong relationship between personal networks and residential location choices. We can do so much more of our networking via digital means now. We've proved that. Let's just make sure we've got the infrastructure to enable us to continue doing that.
Yeah, thank you. It is an interesting proposition that as people use digital technology and maybe go to work physically less days per week, will that lead to decentralization of where people live? Indeed, it raises a question which we don't have time to go into as to what will the future office look like. So I'd like now to thank our participants for listening in. We had over 200, but also special thanks to our panelists for the great commentary. Sadly, we couldn't get to all the questions. There were a lot of them. There's over 40, and we will make an effort to provide answers to them and put them up on the web in due course. So thank you all, and good morning to you all.